Alright, once again, another deck profile on a deck I had since the beginning, but did not do a profile on because everyone's gonna have the same exact deck pretty much, and this time it's Luard. My favorite dragon wizard that literally turns into a dragon. And I had Luard since I played G, and it was one of my favorite decks ever since it first came out, but I never played it in V. But then once when D series brought back Luard, I definitely had to have it, especially as the premium version, making it all shiny. And I'm really glad they actually brought the deck back and not as OP when it was with V, because I remember when Luard first came out at G, it wasn't really that OP until pretty much Drag Strider came out. Although Ogma actually made the deck pretty good, and speaking of Ogma, we just recently got a new stride, that being Ogma, one of the other main alternate strides. With of course some new cool support with it, which is literally just one card, and along with an order card from pretty much last year, and some indirect Shadow Paladin support that also helps out the deck. And that's mainly because of Phantom Blaster reasons. But this was definitely one of those decks that I was glad that they brought back, and with recent support, I was definitely excited, especially since Ritual was one of my favorite mechanics ever since release, and the idea of a wizard turning into a dragon was just awesome that I just have to have this deck again. Even though the strength of the deck is pretty much similar to its original counterpart, and on release it was still pretty strong, although more restricted than the original. And that is something I do have a little bit beef about this new version of Luard, is that this new version is a little more restricted than the original, and that's just basically with the finisher stride, because it's more restricted to just ritual units. So that's my only beef about this new version, but other than that, I'm just glad to see it back, and still find it an awesome deck. And speaking of Ritual, how this deck functions is basically Ritual functions in a way where based on how many grade 1s in your drop zone. Every grade 1 is one Ritual. And most of them are going to say Ritual 3, and it goes to 5 and then 7. Maybe we'll have a Ritual Cross or Ritual 4 one day, because that's what we originally had when it came to Drag Abyss Luard. And that was a Luard possessed by Gize, which was the final main antagonist of G. Maybe they'll bring that back one day. But anyway, with all that out of the way, let's just begin with the deck profile with, of course, the Ride deck. So first off, here's the starter, which you have to run because of the Stride deck set, in which, just like every other Stride deck set, we got the grade 1 that searches for your crests, in which the crests, other than basically 5k power to your whole front row for every face-up cards in the G-zone, and also lets you use Stride. The unique ability is that if you perform a stride without a cost this turn, aka through Luard's ability, you can return a critical trigger from your drop zone to the bottom deck, which is technically a reference to the original Benio Owl, which we still don't have, which was Luard's critical trigger that had the ability to return itself back to the bottom of the deck. And I do find this little mechanic pretty awesome because this is definitely one of those decks that can technically deck out due to the amount of superior calls you get, and I'll explain why with the grade 3. But having a card to let you return your triggers back, especially even if it's crits, is kind of rare these days other than through Raziel. In which we go to the grade 2, where when your grade 3 Luard rides on top of it, you can Soul Blast 1 to draw a card, and you're going to Soul Blast this card to do it because it has a second ability where, because when a grade 4 Luard is striding on top, you can discard a card from your hand to call this to rearguard. Unfortunately, your new stride is not a Luard, but this ability is very handy just for the fact that it lets you basically activate Luard's ability, especially on your first stride. Now, the only thing is, technically Maple exists. And unfortunately, I do not have extra copies of Maples for this deck, so I do use this skill quite often. But this skill does come up when you're on your first grade 3 ride, just because that discard does actually come up for your basically ritual count. And then finally we go to the grade 3, which is the Dragheart Luard, which has the Ritual 3 ability where it lets you choose 2 normal units from your drop zone to put back to the bottom deck, and then you can stride without a cost. So meaning now you don't need to discard a grade 3 to basically pay for the cost of the stride. And this was the unique thing about Luard. Just like the original, because it is a copy and paste of the original, you pay without a cost. That was the most unique thing about Luard, and technically Luard was actually the unit that started the part where you just pay without the cost, and this one literally just lets you recycle just as a cost, basically. But anyway, now to the Stride skill, where when you stride on top of it, you can Counter Blast 1 to choose one of your rear guards and retire it, and insert your deck for 2 grade 1 or less cards and call them to rear guard. Which is of course a handy ability since it's a retire 1 for a +2, but usually on your first grade 3 ride, you're not going to have anything. But this is where the grade 2 comes in, because you have to stride during your ride phase, and when you have no rear guards, you have nothing to retire, but the grade 2 can call itself back by letting you discard a card to do so, which will become a retire fodder for you to call your 2 units. So that's where the grade 2 kind of comes in, and technically it kind of comes in pretty much all the time. But overall, there's really not much to say about this because everything really revolves around its support, as it's a rearguard centric deck, and along with your strides. And then to continue off with your main deck, of course, run more copies of regular Luard, and just like all the other stride decks, it's not for Persona, but rather for your basically finisher stride, although your finisher stride does not need to use it as a cost to stride it, but it does need it as a cost for its ability. But there are a decent number of ways to search it, so technically you could cut this down to 2, but I like to maximize its ability as that's your still finisher stride. And then we run the order card, Journey to be the Dragon, which, just like the other ones, it turns your stride cost free or your stride ability free. But the unique ability is that you can energy blast 3 with Ritual 5, and you get this ability until the end turn. All your front row units get with 5k power in the end turn, which is of course a useful ability just for some more extra power, although not completely necessary at the same time, since it does kind of clog up your deck and it's just useful in the later game. But I do love the extra power, especially when you're doing multi-attacks, which is actually very easy in this deck because of one card. And so that's it for the grade 3 lineup. Now for the grade 2 lineup. So first off, one of the original MVPs, that's still one of the best cards in the deck, Morfessa. So in the drop zone, it is counted as a grade 1 because it gets grade -1, so that's why it's counted as a grade 1. With the second skill, where when this card attacks while you have a Luard crest, into the end of the battle, it gets plus 5k power, and if your G zone has at least 2 face-up cards, Counter Blast 1 to search your deck for up to 1 card that is different from this one, that is a ritual unit, and call it to rearguard. And I mean with the ritual ability. In this case, this one has a ritual 3, and this is what I mean that I kind of don't like the ritual restriction for the deck, because that means that you are now kind of limited on what you can actually use for the deck. I do kind of get it, but at the same time, it limits the amount of extra stuff that you could run, so it is a little unfortunate at the same time. But essentially, on attack, you superior call ritual unit, which will give you another attack. And also keep in mind, this is not once per turn, meaning that if this card does restand, which it will through Ogma, this card can use its ability again for another superior call. So keep that one in mind. In which next up we run 2 copies of the Undercover unit, because this one lets you search on the top 5 for a Shadow Paladin for 1 counterblast, and also plus 10k power if your Vanguard is a Undercover Shadow Paladin by Soul Blasting 1, but it's just here for more nice options if you want to use it, and it's also nice that you could search for PG if you need it, but it's also not the most necessary card considering the fact that Luard itself can already search for your key pieces. And another one that I'm deciding to run, but you could run more copies, but at the same time, I think 1 or 2 is enough, is the Encounter Recycler. Because when placed on rearguard, if your Vanguard has a clan, you can Soul Blast 1 to discard a card from your hand to search for 1 card with the same clan as your Vanguard from your drop zone and put it back to your hand. So it just lets you recycle if you need it, and it's also nice that you can do your PGs as well. So I am thinking about running an extra copy of this just because of that, since your whole entire drop zone can end up becoming a big ass toolbox in comparison to your deck, but it is personal preference on what you prefer. And so that's it for the grade 2 lineup. Now for the grade 1 lineup, which is the most important lineup just because you need a huge amount of grade 1s for your ritual. So first off, the Abyssal Owl, which is basically the Luard searcher for the deck, as you can discard it to search your deck or recycle Luard from your drop zone, just like all the other stride fodders. Although this one is not a stride fodder just because of Luard's ritual ability to stride without a cost, since in the drop zone with Ritual 3, at the end of your turn, if your Vanguard is Luard, you can bind 2 copies of itself and countercharge 1. So this is also your main countercharge of the deck, hence why you have to run 4. Although you can only do it twice per game in a similar way of basically Cutlass, but it is one of your key essential cards, so that's why you have to run 4, and it's also grade 1 that could discard itself, which does add up for your ritual count. In which one of the other better ritual cards to run is the Drag Wizard Siamese, which was originally not a very popular card, but with this deck, it kind of did. because as Ritual 3, it gets plus 2k power while you have a Luard crest, and also has the ability when placed on rearguard other than during battle, just because you have some battle phase calling, so that's why it makes sense. You can look at top 2 cards of your deck to choose up to 1 card from one of them to call, and then put the other one to the bottom deck, but retire at the end phase of the turn, which is most of the time going to end up retired before the end phase, so it's just another way for you to get a superior call, and it's also a 10k booster, which does actually add up to the numbers. Although the top 2 superior call can miss sometimes, especially when you're going for another ritual unit, which will explain why with the Drag Strider Luard. In which now we go to the new card, Drag Wizard Fromage, which personally I have a love-hate relationship with this version, just because as Ritual 5, this card cannot be chosen by your opponent's card abilities, and your Vanguard is Ogma, it could be counted as 2 retires for the Ogma's cost. I personally don't like the part where it can only be counted as 2 retires for Ogma. If it works with Drag Strider, it would have been awesome, but unfortunately it's only Ogma only. And that's my main issue with this card. That's why I'm only running 2 copies, because if I do strike Ogma, this does really help because Ogma does want to mass retire your own board, and shrinking down the mass retire does help. And it's also nice to have some resist type abilities just in case of certain matchups that you do need. And it does come up sometimes. And then next up to the newer cards are not encounters. So first off, Luminous Wizard, which is not a drag wizard, but it does have the Ritual 3 ability, so that is essential. So when placed on rearguard during your turn, plus 10k, and when this card is retired on rearguard during your turn, even placed on top, by the way, while you have a Luard crest, you can soul charge 1, and then choose one of your Vanguards to get those 5k power in turn. This is a 4-up because not only that this is one of those cards that you're going to call very often, just for being an extra beat stick, it is also one of those cards that you're going to constantly retire, and also it helps fills up soul, which soul can get essential for the deck, and it powers up your Vanguard even further, which on the Drag Strider Luard turn could be very nasty. So this is just an auto 4-of, and the Luard's ability, you're going to definitely call this a lot more often than you should. And then 2, Preservation Angel, because it gets the intercept ability and 5k shield with the Ritual 3. This is usually my Morfessa call, or basically my 4th attack call during my first stride, just because it could act as a 10k shield that can intercept as a grade 1, and in a way it could fill up the drop zone, and even in hand it could be a 10k shield, so there is that as well. Not the most necessary card, but because of its ritual ability, I kind of just let this stick into the deck. Especially since it is one of those superior call targets I do call. If it's not going to be a big beater, it's going to be a defensive card. And then I run 2 Dissection Angel. If you can't afford it, go ahead and just use Painkiller, because most of the time you're not going to use it for its countercharge ability, but more so the Painkiller ability. And also it's a grade 1 that retires itself, so it does fill up your drop zones of grade 1, which also helps out with the ritual count. And then finally 4 PGs, because PGs, but do run the Shadow Paladin one just because you got the Shadow Paladin Search and also Recycle. And then now to the trigger lineup. OT, run whatever OT you want, but I kind of like the drive checking with this deck just because the amount of superior calls of grade 1s plus drive checks, and the amount of trigger recycling that you have in this deck as well. 8 crits to kill your opponent as soon as you can, and also because your crest recycles crits, so you do want to maximize on the crit. 3 draws, so you could actually draw your key pieces. Arguably, you could also run maybe soul fronts, but sometimes you don't have those key pieces as this is still a rearguard reliant deck. And finally 4 heals, 2 being counters. And now to the main part of any stride deck. Time to go on to the strides. So first off to our first stride of the deck, the Drag Driver Luard, which is the half dragon form of Luard, which is pretty awesome. And its ability is on Ritual 3, when this card attacks, you can counterblast 1 to choose 1 ritual card from your deck and call it to rearguard, and also flip a card from your G-Zone face up, which will now be your new stride, just because of all the new alternate strides having that unique ability of needing each copy face up. And essentially this is just your multi-attack. I know in Japan they focus more on Drag Driver, just so you can focus on the multi-attack, because one thing you can do with this is that if you use this as second stride, you can superior call Morfessa, and Morfessa can call another unit, thus giving you 5 attacks, or at least 5 attacks, because in some cases if you already have a Morfessa on board, you can superior call another Morfessa, and Morfessa can do another superior call. So a lot of shenanigans you can even do with this even after the first stride. But this is your first stride regardless, so you just have to run this, and especially you have more than enough space, so you just run 4. In which we go to the finished stride, that being the Drag Strider Luard. So Drag Strider Luard, just like the other ones, need to stride with the copy of the same card name as your Vanguard. Although with Dragheart, you kind of just skip that, but the part that does require you to use a copy of your Vanguard is its main skill on Ritual 7. Because when this card attacks, if you have at least 5 units with the Ritual ability as rearguards, basically a full board, it gets plus 10k power and a crit plus 1. But also, you can retire 2 of your own rearguards and discard a grade 3 Luard from your hand, and it gets drive plus 1, and your opponent cannot use any grade 1s or higher to guard the attack, which is definitely very strong because this is literally the original guard restrict type skill that the original no Kanzengato types would have, but even stronger because it literally says you can only use trigger units to guard the attack or blitz orders. And there's ups and downs between this and the original. The original one just only discards cards but doesn't require you to have a full-on ritual board. Although the original one does let you power it up based on how many cards that you discard, you need to discard at least 2, while this one just gets plus 10k and 1 crit regardless. So depending on how you see it, it could be an upside or a downside, but overall it is a very powerful finisher stride, especially if you consistently can build up your board. But there are games that you might not have the board because you might be at a retire matchup, and if you can't keep up that board, then this stride is just kind of dead. Especially since you still need a full board just for its 10k power and 1 crit. And you have to get that part first before you could even get the guard restrict. So there are some games that this stride can be dead, but it is a very powerful stride regardless, and it's a very powerful finisher, especially for a quad drive crit guard restrict. And then finally, to the new alternate stride, the Drag Anger Ogma, which is unfortunately not a Luard. So unfortunately you can't even use Leofold's ability. But its skill is that you can Soul Blast 1, and then you can retire as many rearguards as you want with different names, and then your opponent chooses the same number of rearguards as the ones that you retire as the cost, and retire them. And then if you retire at least 3 of your own cards, you draw a card. And then you also get this skill. When this card attacks, you can counterblast 1 to choose one of your rearguards with the ritual ability and stand it, and then this and that card gets plus 5k power for every copy of itself face up. Alternate stride being the one that is the flip fodder, so of course this is going to make sense, but essentially there's a little up and down to the original Ogma, because original Ogma can also make your opponent lose cards from hand based on how much you retire, but the trade-off from this one is that you get a restanding rearguard, while the original Ogma doesn't. While it would have been nice if we actually get the hand destruction part, just to make it a little more unique, instead of having a restand part, there are some fun combos that you can do with the restand, like 1, restand Morfessa. Because Morfessa is not a once per turn on the Superior Call ability. So Morfessa can Superior Call another unit giving you a 4th attack, and then you can restand Morfessa again, which can also give you your 5th and 6th attack because this restand will be the 5th, and Morfessa will give you the 6th. And depending on the matchup, you might want to stride into this, because there are some games that you might want to clear up your own board before your own board gets nuked by your opponent, hence why the new grade 1 kind of comes in. But also the part where your opponent's pesky rearguards needs to be removed. And this is the only way to actually remove your opponent's pesky rearguards besides from attacking into it. So overall, a cool new alternate stride that does actually come up sometimes. And so that's it for this deck profile on my Luard deck. What do you guys think of it? What other cards would you recommend? And what other changes would you make? Besides from Maple, because I do not have extra copies of Maple, because it would actually be very helpful to get the free Superior Call instead of the discard Superior Call for the retire. But other than that, this deck is just fun. It's not as strong as Shiranui, although this deck hasn't got hit as Shiranui as it basically just lost Saragon. But it was very strong on release just because of all the 2 box axes that you can get, especially with the different amount of grade 1s and builds that you can do, especially if you decide to do the drag driver route instead of drag strider. And that's how the deck was originally built for many people, but I kind of just stuck with the ritual with drag strider. But overall, it is still a fun deck that is pretty upgradable just with any generic, because Luard can literally call any grade 1, and if those grade 1s happen to be generic, it could work pretty well for the deck. And that is something that I really love about Luard, as especially original Luard, playing any grade 1 in the deck just basically means an upgrade for the deck overall. Unfortunately, the only thing I still don't like is the ritual restriction, and I still kind of wish for more ritual units for the deck because I would like to have some better cards. But unfortunately, because there's a lot of cards that says needing ritual abilities, you are kind of restricted on how to build the deck in comparison to the original lineup, but not that restricted enough where you could cut some of them just to play some generic grade 1s that you like. And overall, it's just an awesome deck because it's literally a wizard that turns into a dragon. And while I say this deck is budget friendly, it could be a yes or no just because this is Cater. If you play more generic cards, it's definitely going to be a no. But if you're playing just a pure ritual deck at the moment, it is possible to make this budget, especially since the newer cards are kind of just budget friendly. And it is one of those decks that I could recommend coming in with. But on that, that's for this, and see you all next time.